Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, afternoon, everybody. My name is John Holland. I'm the Chief Development Officer of Pinchin. I would like to welcome you all to our webinar on PSAB 3280, Asset Retirement Obligations for Public Entities. This is a part of our Practice Innovation series, those of you that have attended previous sessions, where Pinchin partnered with external experts to share our current knowledge on practice in our changing world with our broader community. This process started last year with the advent of the COVID pandemic, and we've built on that with more topical issues or more emerging topical issues, and we'll continue doing that as long as over 100 of you keep on attending. So thank you for all of you for being here. Evaluating retirement costs will require further study and a higher level of accounting rigor going forward with this new requirement. Buildings containing hazardous materials, contaminated sites, and solid waste landfills where retirement costs may not have been evaluated present a challenge to all of us on how to meet the new emerging requirements. This webinar will help you, I believe, start to do that process in your organizations. Some examples of asset retirement obligations that fall under this include landfills, buildings, as I mentioned, with hazardous materials, fuel storage tanks, machine shops, hospitals with lab radiological equipment, wastewater and sewage treatment plants, firewater holding tanks, and septic beds, to name a few. Our hope today is, as part of this presentation, that we'll be unraveling some of these issues to you and helping you to move ahead with this process. Just a couple of clarifications. There will be a question at the end, a questionnaire for you to answer. There'll be a QR code that will pop on the screen that you scan to give us feedback. That feedback is very helpful to us in presenting more of these to meet your expectations and be of more service to our community. And this will be recorded and put up on our website. You will get questions on that. So next slide, please, Kaylee. A few housekeeping notes. Get comfortable, check your volume so you can hear us, of course. For the Zoom tools, the chat is for if you have technical issues. The Q&A is for if we have technical questions to ask our presenters, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try and address them at the end. If I could ask participants to press the yellow raise hand button on the screen, on my screen at least, to show that you could all hear us. And we will have a poll as well, which is going to come up just after I do the intro, I think. Next slide, please, intro of our speakers. So actually, here's the poll now. Which sector do you belong to? Healthcare. This will help us kind of frame our responses in respect of our attendees. Healthcare, education, housing, federal government, provincial government, municipal, or other. I've covered all the attendees. We have almost 150 people today, so we want to make sure we get you covered. I'll give that a few minutes for the poll to kick in. I assume that somebody pops up with a graph to show me where the attendees are. There you go. So our breakdown is more heavily municipal, 31%, followed by education, 17%, other 11%, healthcare, 12%. Great representation. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that. And next slide, please, Kaylee. So our four speakers we brought in today, we thank them for making these presentations, all subject matter experts in their field. First of all, Marcus Gonsi, who is a CPA and a partner of BDO Canada, based in Oakville, Ontario. Marcus has over 20 years of experience in public accounting, which includes audit and assurance services to a wide range of for-profit and not-for-profit clients. He is also BDO Canada's educational subsector industry leader. Marcus presents frequently to public sector clients and industry groups on various topics such as changes in accounting standards, fraud, financial literacy. He's an external advisor to Ontario's college sector on the implementation of PS 3280, asset retirement obligations. In lieu of a fee for today, Marcus has kindly offered to donate his honorarium to a charity of his choice. So we thank you for that, Marcus, for that kind donation. The next three speakers are all internal Pinchin presenters. And the first one I'm going to present is not in order, is Dale Weed. Dale runs the Pinchin Kenora office. He's been employed by Pinchin since 2003. He holds a Bachelor of Engineering degree from McMaster University and is a licensed PEng. Dale's been working with clients in the field of civil engineering and infrastructure, environmental due diligence and remediation, indirect quality and microbial contamination, occupational health and safety. He has an experience with turnkey projects and he's a frequent presenter on those subjects. Dale's a PN in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The next presenter will be Sean Douglas. And Sean is a national practice leader for hazardous materials group at Pinchin. He's been working in the field of hazardous materials for over 33 years. He holds a diploma of technology from BCIT, and he is an applied science technologist. Sean's experience includes consulting on hazmat projects in over 6,000 assessments and remediation projects. That sounds like a lot. In public and private sectors, including institutional, industrial, and commercial buildings. Sean's primary practice includes preparing detailed inventories and assessment reports, which he'll go through with us later in this presentation. And the third speaker, the fourth speaker, will be Tim McBride, who is a graduate of University of Waterloo in applied earth sciences. He's a professional geoscientist and a QP ESA under the Ontario regulation. He has over 20 years experience in environmental site assessment, environmental impact monitoring, well installations, geotechnical environmental drilling, and landfill siting and monitoring, and sub-watershed studies. He's worked on the development and implementation of decommissioning plans in landfills, and his experience includes the provision of technical expertise for a variety of closure and remediation investigations, including a hydrogeological assessment installation of interceptor well system for a landfill-derived leachate plume. So some good experience today to help lead us through this process. I encourage you to ask questions of the group, which we'll try to get to as part of the presentation. And with that, I would like to hand the floor to Marcus. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So as John said, I'm a partner with BDO Canada based in Ontario. And I've been, I'd say I'm waist deep in this ARO standard, helping my clients transition to this standard. So I'm going to cover two areas before we get into some of the more technical details. The first is an overview of the standard and some of the high-level technical aspects of it. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about preparing for the transition of this standard and what to expect both from your auditors as well as from your own internal planning perspective as you work towards implementing PS 3280. So with that, on to the first part, which is talking about some of the technical aspects. So first and most importantly, when is this standard effective? It is effective for year ends beginning on or after April 1st, 2022, meaning that March 31st, 2023 and beyond year ends would be the first year end that your organization implements the standard. What is an ARO? An ARO is a legal obligation associated with the retirement of a tangible capital asset. And I've underlined legal obligation because it is a very fundamental term in understanding what is in versus out of scope of this standard. And a legal obligation can exist in various forms, the obvious being an agreement or a contract that you've signed. It can also exist due to government legislation, specifically environmental standards. And finally, promissory estoppel, which is a verbal promise conveyed to a third party that would be legally binding. So if you have an ARO, how do you account for an ARO? Well, the obvious is that the credit side is you're going to raise a liability in your statement of financial position, but where does the debit side go? So if you have a tangible capital asset that is still in productive use, you would be increasing the cost of that asset and then amortizing that over the remaining useful life of that asset. If it relates to a tangible capital asset that is no longer in productive use, you would expense the obligation as a period cost in the year that you measure that liability. The standard suggests that a present value technique is often the best method used to estimate an ARO, but they do not mandate that you do so. I would expect that in practice, we'll see most organizations using a present value technique. I just want to give a high-level example. I know John did a great job of walking through some of the items that would be in scope, and we're going to see some more detailed discussion later on some of those. I'm going to use a little bit of a different example here, just to give you an idea of what is in versus not in scope. And let's talk about a building. This is a question I've received from a number of my clients. If you have a building on a piece of land that you own, that you plan to either demolish or refurbish down the road, but it is only as part of your own capital planning. You do not have an ARO in respect of that. That is simply just part of your organization as you move forward, part of your planning. However, if that piece of land is leased from a third party, which is fairly common, you may have a land lease with the city, and the contract calls for you to return the land to the city free of any structures, then you would have an ARO with respect to the cost to demolish any buildings or other structures on that land and return it to the city in the original form. So that's a little bit of an outside of the box example, but I think it's a good one to illustrate the concept of legal obligation. A couple of relevant standards just to be made aware of in the context of PS 3280. The first being liability for contaminated sites, PS 3260. That standard is currently in effect and it will remain in effect even post April 2022. The difference between 3260 and 3280 is simply that if you have exceeded an environmental standard, you are in 3260 as a contaminated site. If you have not exceeded an environmental standard, you're in 3280 as an ARO. The next section is PS 3270, solid waste landfill closure and post-closure liabilities. If you currently have a liability in accordance with that section will be superseded by 3280. You will still continue to measure those liabilities, but it will now be in accordance with 3280. You would continue to apply 3270 for the next couple of year ends until 3280 becomes effective. On to the next slide, please, Kaylee. So some of the audit implications of an ARO. The most important aspect of transitioning to this new standard is going to be the scoping identification phase, ensuring that you have a good idea of what ARO you might have so that you can work towards the next step of quantifying what that cost might be. So building the right team is paramount. This is not a standard that the finance team alone can implement. You're going to need to involve experts from different areas of your organization to ensure that you're putting yourself in the best position to identify all ARO. Creating an expectation, I think, is fundamental, knowing what to look for. And the part of this presentation will be walking through some of those items in detail to help you build that expectation. Using consultants is going to be absolutely necessary in many cases. A lot of us being finance individuals or other senior management members obviously do not have the expertise to measure the cost to remediate various asset retirement obligations. So you will need to consult an expert for any significant items. And then finally, working with your auditor through the process. This is a very complicated standard, and I think being on the same page with your auditor will be very important. In terms of where to start, your fixed asset listing is a great place to start, helping you go through that and identify where an ARO might exist. Your capital plans or strategic plans, to the extent that you have those, would be also a good basis for figuring out assets that will be retired, as well as the date that you plan to remediate or retire those assets. And then finally, leases. I gave the previous example specifically because it's a bit outside of the box. We commonly think of ARO, we're thinking of, environmental type of obligations, but it may not be an environmental obligation at all. So review your leases and ensure that those leases don't contain any obligations for your organization that could be significant. And then finally, a couple of things to consider. Materiality is always important. You may be able to overlook certain items where you deem the cost to be extremely immaterial, and you should focus your time on those items that are expected to be material. And then finally, transitional provisions, discount rates, possibly inflation rates. If you're an entity that is consolidated into the provincial or federal government's accounts, the government is likely going to want consistent practices in implementing this standard. So I would strongly encourage you to reach out to the government that will be consolidating your organization to ensure that if they would like to mandate a consistent transitional provision, discount rate, or other aspects of applying this standard, that you're doing so to not create work for yourself later. So that's a bit of the high level. And with that, I'll pass it over to Dale, who's going to begin our walkthrough of some of the key items that you might have at your organization.
Thank you, Marcus. So my name is Dale Weed, and I am going to be talking about soil and groundwater contamination for public sites. Sorry, I'm just getting control here of the. So the first question that needs to be asked when we're talking about soil and groundwater contamination is, what is contamination? Well, in short, it's the presence of chemicals, metals, or pollutants which exist in soil or groundwater in excess of the applicable regulatory guidelines. So it's important to realize the guidelines are scientifically based to protect human health and the environment based on potential risk. So these standards are risk-based. That means that contaminants can be present in soil or groundwater at concentrations below the standard, and it's considered to be clean or acceptable risk. And it's only when they exceed the concentrations in the standard that it's considered to be contaminated. Now, these soil and groundwater standards are generally provincially regulated, but a lot of the provinces have adopted the CCME guideline from the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. And some of the provinces in the country have developed their own standards, but regardless, they're all using a risk-based approach to develop their standards for soil and groundwater. So knowing what contamination is, how does soil or groundwater contamination occur? Well, there was a period of time when soil and groundwater contamination essentially occurred through ignorance. There was lack of regulatory oversight, regulation, soil and groundwater standards, protocols, safety measures. It was just, people didn't know any better. And so there were certain contaminants that would have been handled and used, stored, deposited on sites that really had no governing regulation to dictate how to properly handle and store and dispose of those materials. But by and large, a lot of the soil and groundwater contamination involves a release to the environment. And when I say to the environment, I'm speaking specifically from the manufacturer supplied containers or vehicles or wherever these contaminants might be stored or generated to the surface of the ground or into the ground to affect soil and groundwater. So that comes in the form of leaks, spills, or deposits from things like fuel or chemical storage, waste generation that might occur from operations on the property, or waste storage in general. Or even it's possible that there could be impacts due to events or offsite activities that aren't typically related to the historical property use, but still have a potential to impact soil or groundwater on the site. So for the ARO evaluation process, you can see there's a number of steps that I have up here on this slide, and this covers the entire chain of events from initially identifying a property that has a potential environmental ARO and taking it through the identification, the assessment, the sampling, up to actually the remedial action plan and developing a strategy and costing of how does that environmental liability get addressed. And that ultimately would form the ARO for a site with contaminated soil or groundwater. It's not anticipated that every site is going to go all the way through this process. In fact, it's more likely that the vast majority of sites are only going to go through the first step or maybe the second step, where they get screened out as sites that do not have the potential for significant soil and groundwater impacts. And it's only those sites where that potential exists that will be subject to further assessment and further planning. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, the farther you go through this process, the more time and resources it actually takes to develop an ARO. But again, that's only going to be sites that actually have the potential for that contamination. So the first step of that evaluation process is the desktop screening process. So if there's a list of fixed assets that you have in your organization, based on all the information you have about those sites, based on property use, your development history, the location, and any other records that might be available for the site, the first question that needs to be asked is there any reason to suspect, based upon your records, the activity at the site, and the history of the site, that there's the potential for contamination of soil and groundwater? If the answer is no, then really no ARO would need to be assigned for this site. There's no reason to suspect impacts. and there would be no recommendation to go further through the process. If there is the potential based on, maybe the development history of a property wasn't known prior to your acquisition of it, maybe there's been some historic activity at the site that does raise the potential for some contamination, then the recommendation would change to yes, and it would go to the next phase of the process, which is a phase 1 ESA. Now, phase 1 ESA process, so phase 1 is a standard due diligence document. There is a standard for what comprises of phase 1. The principal components are an information and records review that is much more extensive than the desktop screening, because this involves going to historical records, regulatory databases, regulatory records, and really trying to identify all the pieces of information that might be used to paint a picture of the historical operations and the environmental conditions of the site going back to the time of its first development. It also involves doing a site assessment and interviews with someone knowledgeable about the current and historical activities at the site that could also shed light on environmental condition. So all this information is compiled and evaluated, and ultimately a report is prepared with one of two recommendations. Either all this information leads to a potential concern regarding environmental condition at the site, or nothing was identified. If nothing's identified, similar to the desktop screening, then there is no ARO that would need to be carried. You would essentially put the phase 1 on your file, you would justify it in the record so that it's available for future reporting periods, for review by the auditor if necessary, but the process would essentially stop there. If there is the identification of the potential for contamination, there's the opportunity to take a look and say, well, we do have the opportunity, but is it a low risk concern or a potentially higher risk concern? A lower risk concern, there may be the opportunity to prepare an ARO, a conservative ARO for that cost, just based on the fact that it does not represent a significant liability or a significant risk. And you can provide your justification on how you arrived at that ARO, but no further work is required past that. If a phase 2 is recommended, that is where sites have an elevated risk, where the potential for that risk is just so high that it needs to be confirmed and it needs to be determined, so a proper ARO can be determined. So when we talk about risk factors that increase the risk for potential ARO in a property, what are we talking about? Well, we have to ask ourselves some fairly straightforward questions. First off would be, what's the nature of the contaminants that were identified in phase 1? Not all contaminants are created equal. Some readily move through soil and groundwater a lot easier than others, potentially representing a larger risk for more significant impacts. Some can contaminate soil or groundwater even at very low concentrations, so they also represent a higher risk. Then there's questions about, well, okay, if these contaminants or chemicals were present on the site, what is the potential that this got released to the environment? Well, that might open up other questions, such as how long was that activity or that storage present on the site? How was it handled or stored? And based on similar sites, generally a consultant will be able to tell you, based on our experience, that this type of storage or activity generally result in the potential for release to soil or groundwater. Another question might be, what is the potential severity if there was a release? So if there's concerns that are very close to, say, the property line or very close to a building, that would elevate the risk, because the potential for liability for offsite migration, or the liability that it could affect the operation of the site building would elevate the risk and further move it down the process for developing an ARO. So one of the activities that tends to be very high risk is fuel storage and fueling on the site. And one of the highest risk aspects of this is the UST, or the underground storage tank. One of the reasons that these are considered high risk is generally because an underground storage tank is a buried tank. small leaks, spills, overfills of a tank that's buried underground is not going to be readily visible to anybody on the site. So these leaks have the potential to go for extended periods of time if they did happen. They also contain fuel, and this fuel is a high risk contaminant. It passes readily through soil and it can impact groundwater, and a fuel tank can generally impact a fairly significant area and represent a significant liability. So an underground storage tank, I've got some photographs up on this slide, and this is a public sector building where this is a heating oil tank that had been left on site as an obsolete tank. It wasn't in use, and you can see the natural gas connection that serves as the heating fuel for the building and has for decades, but the original tank was left in the ground. This is not as uncommon as you otherwise would think. In fact, when we went and investigated this tank, it was partially full of fuel and partially full of water. That's generally a bad sign, because if water is getting in your tank, that means fuel can also get out of the tank. The center photograph shows, you can see the sheen or the evidence of fuel that's actually floating on the water that's in the excavation itself. And on the right-hand side, you can see this picture was actually taken from inside the tank. And what you're seeing there is the holes created in the tank through corrosion and pitting, and that's daylight shining through the tank from outside to inside the tank. So that's what makes these underground storage tanks, very high risk. And that's coupled by the fact that, based on our experience as consultants, there is a very high potential for not only that these tanks can corrode and leak, but also a very high potential that when they do leak, they can lead to significant liability. Oh, sorry, Alan. So chemical waste and storage. Chemical storage and waste storage today is a much different process and is regulated and handled by industry much differently today than it was historically. Today, the containers, the labeling, the manifests, the inspections, and the general storage methods are much higher and have a much lower risk of potential release of impacts to the environment. But unfortunately, historically, that wasn't always the case. Prior to there being environmental regulation for those contaminants or any type of protocol for how those chemicals and waste needed to be stored, there was a very high potential for release to the environment, release to soil and groundwater. And the more chemical or waste storage that would have been present at the site, so the longer that operation may have run, or the longer or the greater the volume of waste that would have been stored, the higher the potential risk would be. During a phase 1 site assessment, there would be a site walkthrough, and one of the things the assessors would look for is staining on the ground or evidence of stressed vegetation. These can be telltale signs of potential release to the environment of contaminants. And if they are encountered by an assessor during a walkthrough, it's something that could get flagged for further investigation. Above ground storage tanks, while these fuel tanks contain fuel, they're very they're very similar to underground storage tanks in the fact that they contain fuel, but above ground storage tanks are lower risk in the fact that they do not have the potential to release underground. They would have to basically leak to the ground surface, which is easier for people to observe. We would generally look for pathways for those fuel tanks to possibly reach to the ground surface. So with these risks, we would then look to do a phase 2 ESA. So the phase 2 is the actual sampling of the site. So it's to confirm if contamination is actually present on the site. And it may require, once contamination is confirmed, it may require more sampling just to confirm, okay, well, if contamination is there, how much of it is there? To determine the extent and severity of the contamination. We also use it to gather information in support of determining appropriate remediation strategies and costs. So methods for a phase 2 would involve borehole drilling, essentially mobilizing a drill to site, pulling up soil and sampling it to send to a lab to determine condition. With the borehole drilling, we could install groundwater monitoring wells. This is a screen and casing that goes inside a borehole that allows water to enter into the well, so it could be pumped out and sampled, and the water quality can be determined. And possibly even test pits. Test pits are a little bit more disturbance, and you need the correct site to be able to accept putting a 3-foot wide excavator bucket into the ground. You might not want to do that when it's built up with asphalt and concrete, but if the site is appropriate for it, it's a very cost-effective way to do a shallow soil investigation. So once we've confirmed and determined the extent of impacts, when we're planning a remediation, we want to take certain factors into account. And one of those obviously is going to be the total cost of doing the remediation or cleanup, the potential disturbance to the site that cleanup would involve, this whole time frame of the project, as well as future redevelopment plans for the site. So the methods of remediation or remedial strategy, ex-situ means off-site. It's essentially the excavation of impacted soil or groundwater, removal of the material off-site and bringing in fresh fill to replace it. It's the most complete solution, but it's not always the most practical, because if the impacts are close to buildings that are on site or general site improvements, it may not be practical to try and excavate out all the soil that might be beneath it. Alternatively, in situ means on-site remediation and monitoring. There's natural processes through biological or chemical degradation of contaminants that can lower the contamination level over time. That's called natural attenuation, and Mother Nature does it naturally, but we can accelerate those processes through bioremediation or chemical injection. This will greatly shorten the amount of time compared to natural attenuation, but it's still a much longer time frame when compared to the ex-situ remediation. But in the end, it might represent a lot less disturbance of material on the site. And then there's the option for the risk assessment. Going back to the very first slide, I said the standards were developed using a risk-based approach. Those risk-based approach that develop the standards are what's called generic standards. So they don't take into account the depth of impacts or whether it's under the parking lot or under a building. A risk assessment compiled by a qualified risk assessor can develop site-specific criteria for the property that might allow impacts to stay perfectly well in place, and you may not need to do any intrusive remediation. So a remedial strategy might involve a risk assessment, in situ and ex situ, or any one of the three. This is an example of sample remediation for ARO. It involves a combination of ex situ, in situ, and natural attenuation, as well as a risk assessment. And what it does is it describes the different costs, both initial capital costs as well as annual costs over the duration of the project. It also identifies the total years of operation that this project would take, and it'd be up to the client to select a remediation strategy that makes the most sense for them. And it's that total, it's that cost that would then be carried for ARO in the future. And that's all I have for the presentation today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dale. Just while we're waiting for the next presenter, just to clarify, this presentation will be available afterwards, posted on our website. Questions on that, and we'll take questions at the end. We've got some already. Thank you to the audience for those.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Tim McBride, and I'm here to talk to you today about closure and post-closure liability relating to landfill and waste disposal sites. One of the things we've noticed recently is there's been a real shift in people's thinking regarding landfill sites. And I would hope that your organizations are sharing this trend that we're seeing. You know, we're getting away from the fact that people just think that this is a dump and people are starting to look at it as an asset. And I think part of that is because there's the realization is becoming apparent to people of what's involved in trying to get a new landfill site, and some of the challenges and the time constraints that go into that sort of thing. So really, there's been a big movement now for people to optimize their landfill sites and try and maintain them in such a way that they are working towards a closure plan that is a little bit easier on the pocketbook, and at the same time meets all the regulatory requirements and minimizes the impact to the environment as well. One of the things we recently did, we did a feasibility study for a community, a small community of about 3,000 people. And through that, we were trying to figure out what was the best waste management option for this community. And did we want to invest money in expanding their existing landfill site, or try and get a new site approved, or abandon it altogether and look at hauling waste to an adjacent community and pay that sort of thing. So in doing that exercise, we pulled up some stats of what we think people generate, and then typical tipping fees, and we tried to develop what it would cost per person per community per year. And we figured that just disposal alone would be $60 per person per year. So when you look at a town of 3,000 people, that equates to $180,000 in tipping fees a year. So if you have a landfill site that had a considerable lifespan still remaining, or you were opposite, you didn't have a landfill and you had to look at shipping it off site and disposing it somewhere else, that could be a considerable investment, I guess is the best way to put it. You'd have to expend a lot of money to deal with your waste disposal. So in light of that, like I said, I think a lot of people are starting to realize the value of their landfill sites, and they're starting to treat them a little bit better. So in order to figure out what your closure costs and your post-closure liabilities are, you have to have a good understanding of where your site is today. Most sites have some sort of limitations placed on them, whether that's a limit of the amount of waste you're allowed to receive by volume, or sometimes it's an aerial extent. You're only allowed to have a waste footprint of 2 hectares, and most of the time that'll be specified in your license, all of those things. Sometimes you'll get into sites where you actually have other restrictions as well, where you have an approved footprint, but there's a limit on your waste height, due to visibility from adjacent properties or other influences like that, that would have been wrapped into your approval process. And then the other aspects of it are, there's usually design criteria within your regulations. So you'll have, side slopes, they'll be specified at, most jurisdictions are 4:1 with a 20:1 crown on top. So if you have a designated landfill footprint, those design criteria really dictate how much waste you could fit in there. So what we like to do is figure out where we're at today, which is this green line, get an idea of what our approved landfill cap or volume would be, what's the available airspace remaining. And this particular example we're showing here is actually a proposed expansion, so that we could figure out how much additional waste we could get and convert that into years of life. So yeah, one of the ways we do that is through annual topo surveys. Lots of sites have scales, and that's all fine and dandy, but the weight that you bring in doesn't always translate well to in-place volume. So what we do is, maybe if your site doesn't receive a lot of waste, we wouldn't do it annually, but we do frequent topo surveys, let's say, and using that, we can calculate what your average waste deposition rate would be. Then what we would like to do is develop a development and operation plan for the site, and that will help us figure out a way that we can maximize or optimize the available airspace that's left in the landfill site. And we work towards, this here is an example of, the current site condition, phase 1, phase 2, and there's kind of a method to our madness as how we develop the landfill site so that we can cap the site as we go along and optimize the amount of waste that we put into the site. And in doing that, combined with the annual topo surveys and the available airspace that we develop through the waste capacity assessment, we figure out what the lifespan of the landfill is just based on the volume. The other component of it that's really important is the contaminating lifespan of the landfill site. So similar to what Dale was talking about, where you have contaminant sources, the landfill itself is a huge contaminant source. So as precipitation falls and infiltrates through the waste deposits, you end up with leachate generation, and that leachate generation is going to follow the groundwater flow direction. And either your site operates as a natural attenuation type site where it flows and dilutes itself, and other hydrogeological processes occur and manage the plume, or you would have a leachate management type facility where you would pump it and treat it and do that sort of thing. The default contaminant lifespan for most jurisdictions is 25 years post-closure. So even once you're done with this landfill site and you put a cap on it, you're not done with it. You still have to carry out the post-closure period for a minimum of 25 years. Often we run into sites where the contaminating lifespan exceeds that 25-year period, and we have to account for that, in our post-closure processes all the way out to the end. So the last piece of the puzzle is the closure concept, right? Like once we understand the asset and the life of the asset, what is our strategy at the end of the game to close the site? Most jurisdictions require, to apply some sort of impermeable cap on top of the landfill site and then vegetate it as well. There are definitely advantages to doing a progressive closure. The photo I'm showing here in the top right-hand side shows the landfill that's being progressively closed. In doing so, you eliminate a lot of these other risks, such as airborne litter that's picked up by the wind. It eliminates your risks or potential for fire hazards, and it also reduces the amount of animal track out that you can get. So you're not always chasing garbage around your site and trying to bring it back in to the active waste site. The other financial aspect that's really important is if you progressively close your landfill sites as you finish the cells in accordance with the sequencing plan or the development plan that I showed earlier, you don't have to carry those costs in your post-closure liability because you've already closed them. So it's really important, if you can, to try and develop the site and close the site in a specific sequence, and that way you don't have to account for that in the long run. This is an example of a site where we developed a sequential closure plan. So this site was going to be closed with a foot of sand with a manufactured clay membrane, and then another foot of sand and some vegetative cover on top of it. So what we did here is we worked, from the top left photo or image, sorry, we closed these cells that are on the eastern end of the landfill site, and then we worked on those ones, brought them up to the designated design contours, and then once they reached those contours, we applied the cap, and then we moved to the next cell, fill those up to the desired design contours and close that, and then the last one is in the bottom right corner, sequence 4. We show how the southwest lobe of the landfill is closed. Sometimes the closure plan will be derived by requirements in your license. It'll dictate, what you're allowed to do for end of use. When these closure plans are required is sometimes problematic as well. Some of the licenses say that you actually only need a closure plan to be submitted when you're within 2 years of closure. However, it's really hard to do your closure cost estimating if you don't know what the plan is at the end of the day, and it hasn't been approved by the regulators. So, like I said, most closure, you put a low permeability cover system on top of it. So real simple, you shape your wastes to the approved contours and slopes that are allowed in your jurisdiction. And then from there, you apply your cover system. And sometimes that could be as simple as just putting 2 feet of clay that's properly placed. It has to be put in lifts and compacted to certain specifications to ensure that you get the impermeable quality. Or alternatively, if you don't have clay readily available in your area, you can use a geosynthetic clay liner with other materials that are more locally available. For the post-closure care period, there's certain things that are required. Like Marcus said, we already have an accounting standard for landfill liabilities. So within that, it dictates a lot of the stuff that we have to account for. So, final cover and vegetation inspection to make sure your landfill cap is performing according to plan. Any other infrastructure you leave on site has to be, inspected and maintained, whether that's roads or fencing, or even your groundwater monitoring network. And then, of course, with that contaminating lifespan we talked about, you also have to provide an allowance to maintain and monitor your groundwater monitoring network for that contaminating lifespan. Lastly, there's also a contingency formula that's built in to the existing standard that you have to apply to account for, ongoing issues if you were to have to, buy additional lands or entertain a less passive, let's say, a less passive treatment system. So yeah, your change in liability, like we typically do this for our clients on a year-to-year basis. And this is usually how we present it, is we figure out what the total cost for the landfill closure and post-closure period would be. We apply a capacity factor. So if your landfill was only 50% full, we would only require you to have 50% available at this time. And then we also have what you had on the books for it last year. So we show how much things are changing from time to time. So this is an example of the cost sheets that we do for closure care estimates. For here, we have a landfill site that has a relatively small landfill footprint. It's 1.38 hectares. So what we've done here is figure out what the costs of the regrading the waste would be. That's the top line. Then the next line is application of the clay cap and vegetation. As you can see, that cost starts to climb pretty quick. And as you can imagine, this is a small landfill site. Once your landfill sites get bigger and bigger, there is a bit of an economy of scale in the application and earthworks, but at the same time, this number can really start to climb quickly. And then there's other miscellaneous stuff that we've included too in there, and you can see those comments. Maintenance of the monitoring wells and leachate wells and that sort of thing, we're able to incorporate that into the existing operations of the site, because under the licenses of most sites, that's required during your operational phase as well. So we're not double counting that, similar to the roads and fences. So then when we get to the post-closure care side of things, usually what we do is we only apply a percentage of the final cover, inspection, and vegetation. We're not, like I said, that clay cap is very, very expensive. So you do have to make sure that there's no rills or gullies in it that are presenting a breach that could have infiltration and generation go through it. So we do have to carry an allowance for maintenance and inspection and of those types of let's call it infrastructure. And then down, we work our way through the sheet. Everything's accounted for, even the monitoring program for the post-closure phase. And like I referenced earlier, there's also a contingency, and that contingency is based on a formula that's provided in the accounting standard. So as we work through that, we figure out what our total expenditure is. And like I said before, it's a factorized expenditure. So, you know, we're in this particular case, we're not asking this client to have the $900,000 on hand today, because they're only at 60% full. So we're suggesting that they need 560,000. But on the books the previous year, they carried 610,000. So they're actually ahead of the game here. So the one thing, like Marcus said, it's really important to have a team and relevant data. As you can see, there's a lot that goes into these calculations, and it has to be pretty accurate, and it has to be relevant locally. We have to make sure that there's clay available in the area if we're proposing to use a clay cap. And then we have to actually go out and figure out what the cost of that clay would be, and figure out what the market, you know, is for earthworks and that sort of thing, so that we can have these numbers actually, you know, reflect the cost in any given community, or for any community or organization rather. So like I said, as far as landfills go, a lot of my clients are you know, ahead of the curve, because we do have the existing standard out there. But we do come across communities and organizations that, you know, have these numbers done on what seems like the back of a napkin. So and the auditors are seeming to catch up with them. So we're trying to bring everybody up to this new standard. And I think with the ARO, you know, standards that are out there now, or that are going to come into effect, it's going to level the playing field for everybody. Okay, John.
Okay, Sean, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Douglas, and thanks for attending today. I'll be speaking to hazardous materials. So a bit of an overview on hazardous materials. Under the scope of the PSAB, because asbestos is required to be handled and removed in a prescribed manner, and it's legislated under provincial health and safety legislation, whether that's retirement of the building, so demolition of the building, or ongoing construction or renovations, asbestos needs to be accounted for in the ARO. So what is asbestos? Asbestos is used in many building products because of its insulating properties, its fireproofing capability, its strengthening capabilities. It was used in many building products over a long period of time, from kind of like around 1940s to about sort of the mid 80s. Even after that fact, it was used as well, but the use became much more limited. But typical building products that you might see on the screen here, floor tiles, fireproofing, which was applied to steel or concrete to enhance the fire protection, pipe insulation on heating pipes and steam pipes for insulating factors, and drywall joint compound is another picture there on the bottom left-hand corner, is another sort of common asbestos material used in buildings. And not only is there asbestos that could be create a significant liability to the building when it's being demolished, there is other hazardous materials which need to be considered, particularly lead paint, PCBs, or mercury. Lead paint was pretty common up until about 1978. It was added for durability reasons. PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, used as a cooling liquid in transformers and capacitors. It was even used as non-liquid forms, like even caulking and paint on the exterior buildings. We have seen that as well. And that was pretty common up until 1980 when PCBs were banned. and even things like mercury, to a less extent as far as environmental liabilities are concerned, things like control switches, thermostats, and fluorescent light tubes. So a bit about sort of understanding the remediation and costs in relation to asbestos and hazardous materials. Asbestos remediation tends to be the most significant costs for asset retirement. And it does have ongoing costs due to maintenance and renovation activity, whether you're refitting a building or just doing regular maintenance work. Asbestos does actually add to the cost of that as well. And lead paint can add additional costs, as well as PCB disposal can add handling and disposal costs for environmental liabilities. One thing that's important to note is that there are remedial costs associated with typically asbestos and the other hazardous materials. It does vary quite a lot on the type of material that you're dealing with. Provincial regulations are very specific to how that material gets handled. And it can vary from region to region, province to province, and even market conditions can affect how the costs are calculated for handling and disposing of asbestos and hazardous materials. And the accuracy of the estimate ultimately is highly dependent on the thoroughness of the investigation that took place and the experience of the estimator. So a few more basics around remediation costs. Typically, we would provide costs which are based on current pricing. We would, using the quantities available in the investigation, we would apply unit rates to calculate remedial costs. And then we would add contingencies to address some items that may not have been sampled, or some specific exclusions in the reports, or just gaps or other assumptions in the information. So there's I've kind of put up a sort of a step-by-step process on estimating costs. And the first step is to assemble all historical reports that are on file, whether those are environmental reports or previous asbestos assessments. That needs to be provided to the consultant or the expert, and that would be reviewed, and any gaps would be highlighted. And those gaps will ultimately dictate the outcome of the investigation, or sorry, the outcome of the estimate. And then we sort of move into the assessment phase. The assessment phase is relating to site investigation, sampling of the materials, taking quantities of those materials on site and through drawings, laboratory analysis to analyze the material, and then data management. And then the third step is to apply unit rates to those quantities, but also factoring local conditions and regional considerations, and ultimately using professional judgment and experience. And then the fourth step is reporting, tabulating costs, and then stating any limitations that might affect the accuracy of the estimate. So I'm going to run through a few examples here of calculating estimates for asbestos and hazardous materials. So the first one is what I'm going to call a simplified modeling method. And this is where the inventory, or the asbestos inventory, is very limited. There's not a lot of information available. And what we're doing here is we're modeling against buildings of similar use and size. So as an example, if the entity owns 50 buildings and the total area is about 2.5 million square feet, and at some point in time there was a detailed remediation budget that had been calculated on 3 buildings that represented about 180,000 square feet at a value of $630,000, you could do a simplified calculation to work out a cost per square foot. So in this case, the cost per square foot on that building was $3.50 over the average. And then you multiply that by the total area, working out a total remediation cost of $8.7 million. Now, obviously, this is a very oversimplified method. It makes some pretty strong assumptions that there's similar asbestos products within each building and types. And then secondly, it assumes that the building construction detail and configurations are similar. So at the end of the day, the variability is very high on something like this. The second example is a semi-detailed method. So this is where we would have available, or we've already conducted an assessment on site, and we've sampled, quite a lot of materials. And you'll see up on the screen here some of the materials that were investigated, their status, if they're positive or negative for asbestos, the total quantity of the material, and the unit rates applied to that. And as you can see, there are some materials that weren't tested, particularly the ones highlighted in yellow. This was maybe just because it wasn't, it was limited as part of the investigation, so we didn't apply any costs for that on a line-by-line basis. However, we have accounted for a contingency to cover off some of those untested materials. In this case, about a 20% contingency was added to the total estimate to calculate the ARO. Oh, sorry, and just one more point on that one is that the variability on this one is moderate with that kind of contingency. And the third example is what I'm calling the detailed method. It's fairly similar to the previous one. This example, we have a building B, about 106,000 square feet, built in 1979. And as you can see by this list on the screen now, the investigation considered pretty much everything in the building, except for, for one item, which was the built-up roof in one part of the building. The 1970 wing was not tested. And there could be various reasons for that. It could have been an occupied area, and we just didn't want to test it at that particular time, or the client didn't want us to test it. So that item is left unaccounted for. So in this case, the contingency that we're applying on this particular example 3 is a fairly low contingency because of the fact that we've got some pretty detailed quantities and information in the inventory. So at the end of the day, this particular one, the variability is pretty low. So that's hence the low contingency value in this particular example at 5%. And just in summary, with regard to calculating the ARO for environmental liabilities around asbestos, the key points is to make sure that a gap analysis is performed and all the information is thoroughly looked over. Understanding the local market conditions, the regulatory landscape, and the experience of the subject matter expert or the estimator will ultimately dictate the accuracy of that particular estimate. And finally, that obviously, if you have incomplete data, that will likely deliver conservative estimates. And that is it for me.
Well, great. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Dale. Great presentations. We're a bit over, but I think we've got time for one question because a couple of good ones came in. And it's really one for you, Marcus. Would you say the planned demolition costs of buildings owned by a public sector entity after retirement from service will not be considered for ARO? How about decommissioning costs to keep the buildings in safe condition once the asset is retired from service, but no plans to be demolished, like a heritage building?
Just make sure I'm not on mute. Yes. So the second part of the question I caught. The first I might need a repeat, but the answer to the second part is yes. So it does include post-closure operation. So any costs in respect of operating a building once it has been quote unquote decommissioned would be included in your ARO. And could you repeat the first part, please, John?
Well, no, that you've answered it really. The first part was,
okay.
Yeah, you answered it. It was just a preamble to what you answered about the retirement cost post-use. Okay. One more question. Do I understand correctly that contaminated sites do not need to be reported as part of PS 3280 as they are already covered by PS 3260?
That is correct. But if you have one, it should be on your balance sheet right now under 3260.
Okay. Okay. Another question, I think they're all coming for you, Marcus, good sign. We understand that the ARO is to be established for the removal of USTs, underground storage tanks. Most of the UST today are made of fiberglass. What is the fiberglass UST's useful life prior to removal that's generally used for our ARO or amortization? Actually, that's a question for you, Dale, I think. So lifespan of a fiberglass UST.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say that that's probably still premature in the fact that most of the fiberglass USTs have shown not to suffer from corrosion, and the integrity of those double wall tanks, you know, once that trend became in the industry and we went to fiberglass tank, that has kind of continued today. So those fiberglass tanks, in my experience, have not, you know, there's been no corrosion or leaks as a result of them. So typically underground storage tanks are subject to pressure testing and other measures to make sure that they maintain their integrity. And I would say for projected useful life, you know, the ones that are in the ground today are 25, 30 years at least. So I think you'd be able to carry it at least that far.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question. I'll go to it because we're only 6 minutes over. We've got good attendees still on the call. As a hospital, again, question for you, I think, Marcus. As a hospital, we don't sell our properties. We just continue to renovate and manage the ARO as we renovate. Do we carry an ARO on this? I guess continual renovation and operation, but not retirement.
So the only ARO you would carry in respect of that would be environmental ARO. So back to the asbestos example. If you have asbestos, then you will at some point in time have to remediate that asbestos, and you do have an obligation to an environmental standard to do so. So that portion of a planned renovation or demolition down the road would give rise to an ARO, but any other costs relating to the general demo would not be an ARO. And for hospitals, I would say the other big piece would be equipment. So you'd be looking at, you know, X-ray and other medical equipment that may require a safe disposal due to hazardous materials within them that would give rise to an ARO.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, well, we are slightly over time, so I am going to close it off there. But thank you to the panelists. There is a Q&A. We'd like your feedback. This feedback helps us immensely prepare more of these. The attendees show me that these presentations are gaining some interest among our community, so we'd like to keep doing them with your feedback. So if you scan that QR code, you'll go to a questionnaire, which will make it easy for you to give that feedback, which we appreciate. Big thanks to our presenters, Marcus, Dale, Tim, Sean, and big thanks to Kaylee and Rui in the background who make these webinars happen and keep us all on point and do the background preparation to make this such a smooth experience. And thank you to all of you for attending and making us part of your journey as we continue to learn and evolve and adapt through these difficult times. We will keep presenting these, so stay tuned to pinchin.com for more opportunities and more presentations. If you want to be on our mailing list, please email our head office and I'll put your comments in the feedback and we'll make sure we include you on further webinar announcements. Thank you very much. Have a good, safe day, everybody. And thank you. Stay tuned for future presentations. Signing off.